Well, today we are, in a sense, leaving the early church and entering into the medieval church. So, of course, it's certainly not cut and dried as much as historians might like to pretend that it is. Obviously, it's a more gradual shift from one era to the other. But nonetheless, it is going to bring about significant changes in the way people do church in the medieval era. Just to kind of introduce it, let me kind of guide you through some questions and some thoughts about the kind of church we might look for today and the kind of church we might find in the medieval era. In the 21st century, we evangelicals tend to complain about our situation. Modern Christianity is fractured with denominations, with theological disputes. Jesus prayed that his followers would be one, but as we look around, we see little unity in Christendom. And yet, there was a time in history when Christianity was one. We long for political leaders who identify themselves as Christians. But there was a time when this was so. We complain that our society has gone secular. We wish that television, movies, and the media represented Christian values rather than hedonism, lust, and consumerism. Yet, there was a time when all popular culture was Christian. This period of history is known as the medieval era. We're going to find that Christianity pervaded the politics, the culture, the church, the entire society in a very unique way. But we will find that Christianity was very different during the medieval era than it is today. The union of church and state continued to be the political and ecclesiastical reality. And there was an assumption that all were Christians. Catholicism was the dominant religion, but faith was not monolithic. There were still varieties of practices and beliefs. The emphasis was on works, but we see Christianity put into practice. And yet, among some, there still was an understanding of God's grace. One monk wrote that the motivation to forsake the world and follow Christ cannot be had by one's own natural powers, but it is by the free gift of God. We certainly would agree with him about the grace of forsaking the world and following Christ. But superstitions were rampant. We're going to talk about the cult of the saints, purgatory, transubstantiation. And yet, during the High Middle Ages, the scholastics sincerely sought to understand the relationship of faith and reason, to develop systematic theologies and to pursue apologetics, which is an important discipline today. Even apologetics among the Muslims were important to the medieval scholastics, as they are today. As we study the medieval church, we're going to find plenty to criticize. And it is going to be a temptation to reject everything that we read and study about the medieval church. And after all, there is a reason why we had the Reformation, okay? And we're going to see many abuses in the medieval church. But we must also look for the positive expressions of Christian faith during this very different time in history. It is very important for each of us to study this medieval history of the church because so much of it is wrapped up in Catholicism. And remember, we live in a culture today very much dominated by Catholicism. And the more we can understand of the Catholic Church during this era, the more we will understand about people that surround us in our culture today. Okay. Has that sparked any questions or comments so far? Okay. Well, let's move into an overview of the medieval church. And mostly what I want to do here is just very briefly let you think ahead in terms of the periods of time in the medieval church. Remember, we talked about the different periods in the early church era. Those two periods were, well, the apostolic age is part of the ante-Nicene church. Yes, so apostolic, yes. Ante-Nicene is the broader term that we talk about the early church up until what year? 325, yes, sir. And then the rest of the early church era is the post-Nicene era. And remember, the Council of Nicaea, 325, marks the biggest difference in the church. Ante-Nicene church, how would you describe it? What? Councils? No, ante-Nicene.
Small. Persecuted.
Persecuted, small, outside, okay? Persuading, grassroots, okay? So before Nicaea, the church was an organization operating outside the state. Post-Nicene church, union of church and state, in with the in crowd. The persecuted church becomes the persecuting church. Very different. The union with the emperor brings about councils. Okay, so we have the councils in the post-Nicene era. All right, and so let's talk about the divisions of time in the medieval church. All right, thinking about this era politically, we can say that the beginning is the fall of Rome and the Western Roman Empire. This took place in 476 with the deposition of the Roman emperor. And then that would extend to the fall of Constantinople and the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire, 1453. So in one way, we can say 476 to 1453 when we look at the era politically. When we look at it ecclesiastically, we could say that it begins with the Council of Chalcedon, 451, because that wraps up the first four councils and comes up with kind of the summation of early Christian theology. And then that would extend to the last of the councils, the Council of Florence Ferrara in 1439. So essentially we have the mid-400s to the mid-1400s, or just before the beginning of the Reformation, which we date 1517. Okay, so this is the broad parameters of the medieval era. There are three periods within the medieval era. The early period would begin, whether you begin it with the Council of Chalcedon or the fall of the Roman Empire, it would extend until 800. The big events happening here is the invasion of the barbarians and the reordering of society with new people groups. So after the fall of the Roman Empire, then we see centuries of the people in Europe trying to deal with the new reality. No more centralized political power. And in fact, we see the rise of the church as the major political entity in the West. Although in the East, as we will see, the empire continues and continues to have an impact on the Eastern Church. All right, so the early period until 800. 800, of course, is the crowning of Charlemagne by Pope Leo III. And this is a point in time at which we can talk about the Holy Roman Empire, the Carolingian Empire, the empire headed by the Emperor Charlemagne, and we have, once again, we have a centralized political government, and again we have the union of that state with the church. So 800 is an important turning point in the medieval church. And this middle period extends to 1215. Well, in this period, we have the great schism between the Western and Eastern churches. We have investiture conflicts between the church and the state. We have the Crusades during this period of time. So this is a very active period of time. All right, and then 1215 marks the papacy of Innocent III. And Innocent III represents the zenith or the high point of the papacy. He is the most powerful of all the medieval popes. But after him, then we see a decline of the papacy, a corruption of the papacy, and we see events that ultimately lead to the Reformation. It is during this time that we have the signing of the Magna Carta in England, which begins the idea of nationalism. And as different nations in Europe take on their own identity, we're going to see them resisting the influence of the Roman papacy. We're going to see the rise of universities and scholasticism. We're going to see the mendicant orders like the Dominicans and the Franciscans. They're going to participate not only as professors in the universities, but also they're going to participate in the Inquisition, the enforcement of church doctrine on those who dissent. And the dissent is going to grow until we end our discussion of the medieval era with the dawn of the Reformation, and we will look at some of the early reformers who even precede Martin Luther, Ulrich Zwingli, and John Calvin. Okay, so those are the three periods of the medieval era. And important developments that we'll look at along the way are the rise of the papacy and the rise of monasticism. These are the two most important institutions of the medieval church. We're going to see political developments, especially feudalism. And feudalism is going to be a force that envelops the church. Sacramentalism, the idea that the sacraments are salvific. And also we're going to see the rise of Islam, and we're going to find out why it's important for us as Christians studying the medieval church to consider the rise of Islam as an event that has major impact on the church. So these are just some of the things we're going to look at along the way. Okay, again, just a brief pause. Any questions, comments? You'll find that as we go forward into the medieval church, I tend to teach this material thematically, also geographically. I tend to look at the church in the West, and I look at the church in the East. Also, we will look at the church, we'll look at the papacy, then we'll look at monasticism, we'll look at other elements, but then in a certain period of time. And then when we get to the next period of time, we'll again look again at the papacy and monasticism. Later on, we again will look at papacy and monasticism. So instead of looking at medieval history century by century in a chronological way, I tend to choose themes and follow them in a way that is logical to me, and I hope it will be to you. So I want to, for us right now, I want us to look at the Western Church through the 8th century. So very early on in the medieval period, we're going to be looking at the church in the West. All right, the Roman Empire certainly has been one of the most significant influences on the church. It's been a significant partner with the church, okay? But in the 400s, the Roman Empire in the West begins a sharp decline. And so that has a major impact on the church as we know it. The West is overrun by a series of invasions by those that we call barbarians. Now, the word barbarians conveys to us ignorance and violence. It should not necessarily convey those. These were tribes that moved from the east into the west because they saw in the west values and wealth and property that they wanted. They also perceived that as the West was becoming weak politically, this was their opportunity to take for themselves some of the comforts that they envied there. As you probably know, the word barbarian comes from the word barbar, which is just kind of what the Romans heard when they heard these people speaking. They heard bar, 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 and so they refer to them as barbarians. All right, but there were various tribes that moved, and as one tribe moved in and took over, another tribe then would follow and push them further west, and then another tribe would come in its place. The first group to sack Rome was the Visigoths in 410. Right? And when the Visigoths sacked Rome, that sparked a very important event, a very important writing in the Christian church. Do you remember? Who wrote?
Peter Lombard.
No, that would be much later. We talked about this just last week.
Is this just war?
This would be who wrote the just war theory. Augustine wrote the just war theory. He wrote the just war theory in response to the Donatists, but he wrote a treatise in response to this event. All right? The Romans, when the Visigoths sacked their city, the Romans blamed the Christians. Okay, that because the Romans were no longer worshiping the pagan gods, that the gods had forsaken Rome. And so Augustine wrote a very important treatise. And if you don't know the answer to this, you're going to confront it tonight, okay? So the treatise that Augustine wrote after the Visigoths, yes, Jeff, the City of God. So he wrote the City of God with his, that expressed his philosophy of history, that said that there were two cities. The city of God, who functions on the love of God, and the city of man, or the earthly city, that focused on the love of man, okay? And so he said these intermingle, but ultimately only the city of God will persevere. Okay, but this is in response to the Visigoths sacking Rome in 410. All right, Attila and the Huns threatened Rome in 452. We're going to talk more about this event later, but do keep this in mind in terms of the history of barbaric invasions. Vandals again sacked Rome in 455. And finally, the Germanic chieftain Odoacer overran Rome, took control of it, and decided that there was no need for even a titular emperor in Rome, that Odoacer was going to take kingship himself. And so he deposed the last Roman emperor named Romulus Augustus. This is kind of an ironic name for the last Roman emperor. Who remembers the name Romulus from ancient Roman history?
He was a founder of Rome.
He was one of the founders of Rome, okay? And then, of course, Augustus, the name of the first emperor, Caesar Augustus, Octavian. So Romulus Augustus, a very high-sounding name, but didn't have the leadership to match it. So 476 is a very important date in our understanding of the Western Empire, because that's the date that we consider to be the fall of the Roman Empire. Now, obviously, Rome is declining through the entire 5th century, but this is the date when Rome fell. Now, late in the next century, the Lombards occupied northern Italy, and you can see they ruled there from 568 to 774. So for 2 centuries, the Lombards are going to be prominent in Italy, and they will be interacting with the church extensively. All right, so the West is overrun by a series of barbaric invasions, and no longer do we have a Roman Empire in the West. Here's just a map that shows the movement of the different tribes from east to the west coming in to Rome, some of them going into the area we call France, the Franks, the Angles and the Saxons going into England. We have the Visigoths ultimately going into Spain. We have Vandals coming around into northern Africa, and from there they attack Rome and other places. And in the East is relatively free of attack because they are much stronger there. Why would Constantinople be stronger than Rome?
Because they made it the capital city.
Exactly. When Constantine moved the capital from west to east, then this became the strength of the Roman Empire. So this became the strong point. Rome then became weak and unable to defend itself. Now, I'm going to go ahead and mention it now, although I will have opportunity to mention it again later. Now that the empire, what we knew as the Roman Empire, no longer encompasses Rome, we still have an empire in the east, but historians can no longer call it the Roman Empire. And so they look to the name of the city before Constantine changed the name to Constantinople, and before it was Byzantium. And so historians now refer to this as the Byzantine Empire. So whenever we talk about the Byzantine Empire, it is the remnant of the Roman Empire in the east. All right. Yes, Richard.
Just a quick question. What type of violence were these groups doing when they came into a location? Were they completely just raping and pillaging, or was it more of a assimilation? You come in, you take over the leadership, and then you accept the people in those regions?
Mm-hmm. Well, at first, they conquered by violence because there was resistance. And we read about the sacking of the city, which means that they would be destroying public buildings, and they would be overthrowing the rulers. In some cases, they actually would burn the city. But in other cases, they simply would come in and overthrow them there would be little resistance because little resistance could be offered. And then there was more of an assimilation. And through the centuries, we're going to find that not only did these invaders become assimilated into their territory, but the church is going to convert them. And so many of these invaders, though they come from either pagan or other backgrounds, many of them are going to accept Christianity. So yes, it's going to be both. There's initial violence, but the violence is in relation to the resistance. In other words, less resistance, less violence. Okay. Well, all of a sudden we have Arianism in the West. Remember when we talked about the Council of Nicaea, the Council of Constantinople, we talked about how these issues were mostly Eastern issues. We didn't even have many Western bishops that traveled to the East for these councils because Arianism was never a threat there. However, we have Arian missionaries who evangelized the Eastern tribes, such as Ulfilas, 310, 383. You see that he's active in this period of time, right around the Council of Nicaea until around the time of the Council of Constantinople. And Ulfilas actually invented the Gothic alphabet in order to translate the Bible. So an early church planting Bible translation movement. But Ulfilas was Arian. And so he converted them to an Arian form of Christianity. So many invading barbarians were Arians bringing the controversy into the West. And as I said, once these barbarians entered into the West, they came under the influence of the Catholic Church. Now, an interesting story to tell that is somewhat representative of other stories is the story of Clovis, who was king of the Franks. Okay, where did the Franks settle? What is now France? France is named from the Franks. That time it was called Gaul. But Clovis was a pagan who married a Catholic queen named Clotilda. And Clotilda had their first son baptized. But unfortunately, that first son died, possibly from exposure to the cold water. And so that, of course, dismayed Clovis. When their second son was born, he resisted allowing her to baptize him, but she persisted. And indeed, that second son fell ill also. But Clotilda prayed, and the son survived. So this began to turn Clovis's heart toward the Christian God. Clovis went into a battle against the Allemans and prayed, Jesus Christ, thou art said to give victory to those who call on thee. And he promised to convert and be baptized if he were victorious. And indeed he was. All right. Does this remind you of anyone else in history? Constantine, yes. And so I think it entirely possible that this story is kind of an adaptation of the Constantine legend, but nonetheless, this comes down to us as the story of Clovis. Clovis feared resistance from his generals, but they were all willing to follow this immortal God. And so Clovis, like a new Constantine, was baptized along with 3,000 followers. Okay? So that's, we can tell similar stories about Sigismund and Reccared, but again, what we see is that among the conquerors, they become the conquered of Christianity. All right, so it is during this time that we see the rise of the papacy in Rome. Now, up until this time, it is appropriate only to talk about the bishop of Rome. It is much later that we begin to talk about the Roman Pope. But at this point, the head of the church in Rome is the bishop. But we're going to see how the bishop of Rome is elevated to this higher place of authority throughout Christendom. First of all, there are political considerations. There are political reasons why the Bishop of Rome would become important. Rome was the traditional center of the empire in the West, and so it had its advantages as a socio-political center. The barbarian invasions and the fall of Rome left the West with no political leaders. And so the Roman bishops, such as Leo and Gregory, became the only people with enough authority to intercede with the invaders and to save Rome. And so politically, we see how Rome is still the center of the West. All right, there are a number of theological reasons for the primacy of Rome. Would somebody turn to Matthew chapter 16? Matthew 16. Matthew's got his Bible, so I'm going to ask Matthew to read Matthew. Verses 18 through 20 are probably sufficient. First of all, just to set the context, this is Jesus and the disciples at Caesarea Philippi. Okay, go ahead.
And I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the forces of Hades will not overpower it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth is already bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth is already loosed in heaven.
Okay, so here we have Jesus commending Simon Peter for his great confession of faith. And he says, Simon, you are the rock, and on this rock I will build my church. I will give you the keys of the kingdom, and whatever you bind or loose on earth will be bound or loosed in heaven. Okay, so we have this what appears to be an elevation of Simon Peter among the apostles. All right, we know that Peter came to Rome. Probably the clearest statement is in Peter's first letter, chapter 5, verse 13, when he talks about being in Babylon. Now, we might think, well, Babylon is in the Middle East. Well, no, Babylon was a code word for Rome. We see it in the book of Revelation as well as here in Peter. We have statements by Clement, who was a later bishop of Rome, Ignatius of Antioch, and Irenaeus, who kept a bishop list of the bishops in Rome. And so the early church all agreed that Simon Peter was in Rome. Does not mean that he founded the church in Rome. In fact, we know for certain that he did not. The church in Rome was founded by Jews who traveled to Pentecost, were converted under Peter's preaching, and then returned to Rome to found churches there. Later on, Paul wrote to churches in Rome, and so most likely, Peter was not the founder, but he was present in Rome, and certainly would have been a leader of the church in Rome. We are fairly certain that Peter was crucified in Rome, probably upside down, but he was crucified under Nero's persecution. So we have we have Peter, very closely associated with the church in Rome, Peter whom Jesus elevated. So the Western Church said that Peter had founded the Roman Church, and so Peter's successors, the bishops of Rome, held the keys of the kingdom. All right, because as Peter extended his authority to Linus, then to Anicetus, and then Anicetus to Clement, and so on and so forth, as that authority was passed down bishop to bishop, they had the authority that Jesus had given to Simon Peter, the keys of the kingdom. So the Roman bishops felt like their authority was given by Jesus himself. Now here's another reason for the importance of the bishopric at Rome, and that was the decision by the Council of Nicaea to give regional authority to 4 major dioceses: Rome, Antioch, Alexandria, and Jerusalem. Now, as we've said before, at the Council of Constantinople, Jerusalem was dropped from the list, and Constantinople was put in its place. But the end result is the same. We have 3 dioceses in the east, but only 1 in the west. And so Rome has great priority over other churches in the west. Okay? Now, let's talk about a couple of early Roman bishops who had tremendous power and authority. The first is Leo I, Leo the Great. We have already mentioned him in connection with the Council of Chalcedon. But Leo made this contention that Jesus made Peter the rock on which the church was to be built, and Peter's successor, the Bishop of Rome, is the head of the church. And of course we know that he intervened in the Council of Chalcedon with Leo's tome, asserting that Jesus is fully human and fully divine. And of course they accepted his tome as authoritative. But in the East, although they appreciated his contribution, they did not feel as if Leo had any authority to assert there, not any greater authority than what each of the archbishops had in Antioch, Alexandria, and Constantinople. Now, here's a very interesting incident that took place in the next year, 452. You all have heard of Attila the Hun. It's called the Scourge of God. And very powerful a military commander with a great horde of soldiers sweeping from east to west. And as he approached Rome, every expectation was that he would sack it and destroy it, as he had every other city. Well, Leo rode out to meet him as a representative of Rome. And this is an interesting representation of the story. This is a bas-relief that's in St. Peter's Basilica, and I believe this is a picture that I took. But here we have Attila the Hun, and here we have Leo wearing the Pope's triple tiara. That's very anachronistic. But nonetheless, here's Leo, and above him are Peter and Paul leading the hosts of heaven against Attila and his army. So the story goes that when Leo came out to meet Attila, Attila saw Peter and Paul in the hosts of heaven, and he was willing to turn away, and he did not enter Rome, nor did he sack it or destroy it. Okay, so this obviously elevated the legend of Leo I. Now, 455, the Vandals came. The Vandals, as you remember from the map, the Vandals had actually had kind of gone around Rome and went through Spain and settled in North Africa. So they were attacking Rome from the south. And they did sack Rome. They entered. Leo evidently didn't have Peter and Paul with him this time. But he did negotiate with them that they would not burn Rome. So they simply looted it. But nonetheless, I think the important thing is that Rome had no political leader to deal with these political powers. And so Leo is the one who had the authority to perform duties that no civil authorities could. And remember, this is 451, so actually this is 25 years before Romulus Augustus was deposed. So there actually was an emperor by title in Rome, but this person did not have the power to deal with these invaders. Whoops. Okay. The next major figure is Gregory the First, also Gregory the Great. It's interesting. These popes are the first by the name. Here's a story. I never know when exactly to tell this, but of course Leo and Gregory were their birth names. But very soon, popes are going to begin to take other names, papal names. And this began with the Pope, I think in the, I don't remember the dates, I should have looked this up, but Pope Mercurius, the Bishop of Rome named Mercurius, I didn't think it was appropriate that he should rule the church with the name of a Roman god, Mercury. And so he took on the name John. And at that time it was the second bishop of Rome named John, so he's John the Second. And then after that, popes began to they began the habit, the practice of taking on new names, so that our current pope took on the name Francis, and he's the first one to take the name Francis. So he's Pope Francis. If another pope takes the name Francis, we'll know him as Francis the First. But he took the name after Francis of Assisi, about whom we will study in a few weeks. Well, anyway, this is the first bishop of Rome named Gregory the First, and he is one of the great ones. So they call him Gregory the Great. And he reigned 590 to 604. And when he came to the papacy, Rome was in chaos. They were at war with the Lombards. The city had experienced the flood and the plague. They pursued him for the bishopric, and he said thanks, but no thanks. But they convinced him that he should be the bishop of Rome. He had been he had come from a wealthy family, and he had established a monastery on his estate, and so he had the desire to live an isolated monastic life, but instead he came to Rome to rule there during a very difficult time. As Pope, Gregory ruled Rome. He did not try to claim universal authority in the East, but he did see himself as the patriarch of the West. Again, he was the one who negotiated the peace settlement with the Lombards, and he was the one that, in the face of the suffering at the time, he would take in the collection of funds that came from the churches through the bishops to the Bishop of Rome, and he administered the distribution of those revenues to those who needed it. And so Gregory was actually one of the best popes. It seems as if the Catholic Church had their best popes early on, and it just kind of mostly downhill from there. Now, he did demand that the bishop's pallium, or the cape, it was a sign of apostolic authority. He insisted that he would confer that pallium on the bishops who were in his diocese, okay, to show that they were subject to his rule. So all of the bishops in the West came under his rule. Now, he had some major influence on Catholic doctrine. He promoted what we call a semi-Augustinian position. Now, we kind of moved through this rather quickly last week, but you remember that Augustine taught single-edged predestination, that God elected some to be saved and passed over the others. But salvation was a result of God's election. Well, the church had the church rejected this idea of election and promoted a semi-Augustinian position, which said that yes, God's special grace comes to all. Yes, God's grace enables the human to choose and perform what is necessary for salvation. God takes the initiative, but humanity cooperates through good works and through the sacraments. So do you catch this? This is a very important part of Catholic soteriology, that yes, God initiates, but humans cooperate through their good works and the sacraments to achieve salvation. Yes, Ryan.
Why would they call that semi-Augustinian and not Pelagian?
Because it is not that humanity is able to do good works and achieve salvation, as Pelagius taught. Pelagius taught that through a person's own goodness, that person can achieve salvation. All right? And so the Gregory and others in the Catholic Church would say that God's grace is necessary to enable a person and to call a person, but that person then cooperates through good works which are necessary. We're going to find that these good works and the sacraments especially are necessary to complete salvation. Purgatory is a doctrine that Gregory codified in the Catholic Church. Augustine kind of hinted at purgatory. There were suggestions of purgatory in other early church documents. For example, the Passion of Perpetua seems to suggest that her brother Dinocrates was in purgatory. But Gregory is the one who actually made it a doctrine, purgatory being a place of purging or purification for those who die in sin. Now, again, we talked last week about the Apocrypha and 2 Maccabees 12 and that story of Judas Maccabeus praying for his comrades who had died. Okay, when we look in the Scripture in the New Testament, and Paul talks about those whose works are gold, silver, and jewels. Others are hay, straw, and rubble, and some are saved as though through fire. All right, that is a suggestion of purgatory. But Gregory taught purgatory because of a personal experience that he had when he was the abbot of a monastery. One of his friars died with unabsolved sin. And this friar came to Gregory in a dream. And this friar was in a place of torment. And he was praying Father Gregory, please assemble the brethren and ask them to pray for me that I might be released from this place of suffering. So Gregory woke up, he called together the brethren, they prayed for their fallen friend, and a few days later, Gregory had another dream where this friar had been released from suffering and was now in a place of paradise. And so Gregory understood this to mean that when a person dies with unabsolved sin, that person goes to purgatory until that sin is purged, and then that person then can be released to heaven. Okay? So this is kind of a folk tale, but nonetheless, it worked for Gregory to assure him that what Augustine had hinted at was true, that there was a purgatory. Okay? He also developed the doctrine of penance, that after sin, there's contrition, there's the contrite heart, there's confession to the priest. The priest applies punishment, and then afterwards the priest can absolve the person of sin. All right, so the doctrine of penance is a series of actions that bring about priestly absolution. But absolution of sin requires the priest. Those who die in faith and communion with the church but without absolution go to purgatory. The living can help the dead out of purgatory by offering masses on their behalf. Okay? So you can see how this is going to develop through the rest of the medieval era and centralizes salvation in the church, not only in the church, but in the offices of the church in particular, so that there is no salvation apart from the church hierarchy. And in Mass, Christ is sacrificed anew. So every time the Mass is celebrated, Christ is sacrificed anew. Okay, now, Gregory had a great impact on Catholic doctrine, also had an impact on missions. The story goes that Gregory in Rome saw a group of slaves that had been captured in England. And so these were Angle children. They were blonde-haired, they were blue-eyed. And he asked, who are these children? He said, they are Angles. No, they're not Angles, they are angels. And so he desired to send the gospel to England. And so he sent a monk named Augustine to England. Augustine established his headquarters in Canterbury, England. So he's known as Augustine of Canterbury to distinguish him from Augustine of Hippo. And Canterbury then becomes the religious center of England, really up until today. All right, so he sent out Augustine of Canterbury. It was during Gregory's reign that Recared, the king of Spain, was converted. All right. Yes, Rebecca?
So, how did he present the whole concept of purgatory in light of sharing the gospel if the way it seems it almost didn't really matter how you live because you could still get out of it?
Oh, well, don't.
I mean, is that,
Let's don't carry it to that extreme. It doesn't. It's not that it does not matter how you live.
yeah.
Remember that salvation comes from God's call, and then our response through good works and the sacraments. Okay, so it is not that it does not matter how we live. Indeed, it matters very much how we live. Okay, and so when he sent Augustine to England, he was to carry the gospel to those people in England that salvation comes through Jesus Christ. Okay? And then their relationship to Jesus Christ comes about through their participation in the sacraments. Okay? Toby?
I just saw that
Recared?
Yeah, he was king of Spain, but I thought he was a king of the ruler of one of those barbaric groups.
He was. He was a Visigoth,
Right.
and he came in with those tribes, and they settled in Spain.
Okay.
And so he was the chieftain of the Visigoths in Spain, and it was around 600 that he was converted. Again, under the direction of not directly by Gregory, but by missionaries that Gregory had sent to Spain. So Recared was just one of the many barbaric chieftains who conquered the territory, but then converted to Christianity. Is that
Oh, yeah.
okay?
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
I'm just thinking of the whole, I have an aunt that's Catholic, and now that this just gives me a little bit more ammunition.
Well,
But,
let's say it gives you a foundation upon which to build an apologetic.
yes, that sounds better. Now that I realize, because if you ask her the doctrine, these doctrines of purgatory and stuff goes all the way back, Jesus and Peter and everything, but now here we have Gregory kind of starting this doctrinal idea of purgatory, and so that's neat.
Yeah. So Gregory actually codified the doctrine of purgatory, which Augustine had hinted at, and which we actually see hints of as early as 200 in the Passion of Perpetua. So it is not that Gregory started it, and it's not that it is based exclusively on this vision that he had, but these were ideas that seemed to be floating around Christianity, and they actually became codified
You put it down.
under Gregory's rule as the Bishop of Rome. And from then on, it becomes a Catholic doctrine. And then it just expands and grows and becomes more abused
Yeah.
through the centuries. And we'll see that over and over again. Yes, Jason?
So because you, the bishop, when he did codify this, there's not much question as to authority, was it like, okay.
That's pretty much true. Yes, I would say that around 600, Gregory was the ecclesiastical authority, at least in the West. Okay, and yes, from then on, in the West, we're going to see the doctrine of purgatory being taught and seeing it grow over the next centuries. Okay. All right. Now, we talked about the papacy. We want to talk about the rise of monasticism in the West. Now, we've already talked about monasticism in the East, but compared to Eastern monasticism, Western monasticism is less mystical and more practical. I mean, it's less an idea of an abstract ideal of the Christian way of life, and it's more of a practical application where you punish the body not for renunciation, but you punish it for training for a mission in the world. And it's not solitary. Monasticism in the West is communal. That is, they gather in monastic communities. And there's less tension with the bishops of the church. Remember in the East, when monks like Anthony finally came out of his 20 years of seclusion, he went into the cities and rebuked the bishops for their lavish lifestyle and claimed to have authority that was greater than theirs. Well, we're not going to see so much of that in the West. Monasticism was the right arm of the church in the West, and often the monastic movements would be geared toward reform of the church. Unfortunately, monasticism also provided opportunities for corruption and abuse. Okay, so it's almost like every movement that starts out good is going to end up not good. Okay, but then there's tends to be kind of a cycle of reform, decline, corruption, reform, decline, corruption. Now, one of the early monks that became well known is Martin of Tours. He was a Roman soldier. He had recently confessed Christ, was not yet baptized, however, when he encountered a beggar. The beggar was naked, so Martin took his cloak and tore it in two and gave half of his cloak to the beggar. That night, in a vision, he saw Christ, and Christ was wearing his half cloak. Okay, so after that, Martin pursued monasticism. However, he was acclaimed the Bishop of Tours, but even while he served the church as bishop, he lived the monastic life. By the way, the French word for cloak is chapelle. And that's where we get the word chapel from the French word for cloak. Okay. So monasticism began to develop in the West, but it was Benedict of Nursia that's known as the father of Western monasticism. That sounds like a good exam question that you may see somewhere along the line. Benedict of Nursia, the father of Western monasticism. He established a monastery at Monte Cassino in Italy, 525. It was an autonomous, self-supporting agricultural community. Later on, this monastery and others became centers of learning and preservation of culture, because in monasteries they developed scriptoriums where they would have the transcription of manuscripts. And also monasteries served as hospitals and pharmacies and hotels. When you were traveling, often it was unsafe to stay in inns, and so you would look for a monastery. And the monks at the monasteries learned medicine, so they became hospitals and pharmacies there. The Benedictine rule became an important way of regulating monastic life. So one rule was permanence. Whenever you joined a Benedictine monastery, whether at Monte Cassino or elsewhere, you agreed to remain at that monastery. So you couldn't move from place to place. So that gave a sense of permanence in society. You agreed to be obedient to the rule and to the abbot. By the way, what does the word abbot come from? Does that sound like a word you've seen in Scripture? Abba. Abba, Father. The abbot was intended to be the father of the monastery. All right? Not always was it so. Abbots often became corrupt and began to abuse the wealth that they controlled, but the idea was that the abbot would participate with the others in physical labor, which was another aspect of the Benedictine rule. Prayer became the work of God. Prayer became the work of the monks. And 8 times a day into the night, there would be the times of prayer. Also, study. They took 3 vows, the vow of poverty, chastity, that is celibacy, and the vow of obedience. So those are the 3 vows of a Benedictine monk. All right, Monte Cassino was destroyed by the Lombards in 589, and so the monks fled to Rome, and there they met Gregory I. And remember, Gregory came out of the monastic life, so he was very interested in hearing the Benedictine rule, and so he commissioned those monks from Monte Cassino to scatter throughout the territory to establish new monasteries that followed the Benedictine rule. And so Benedictine monasticism is the most common form of monasticism in the world. All right, now, most of the time we think of monks as being stationary. We think of monks as hiding within their monastery and not interacting with the world. But in actuality, many of the early missionaries came out of the monastic life. So the monastic life was for them a physical and spiritual discipline that strengthened them to give them the ability to go out into the world and meet the needs of the people. So Patrick of Ireland, is someone doing, yes, all right, Toby. Patrick of Ireland is just one of the great stories of church history. He was just a nominal Christian as a youth in Britain. His father and grandfather were officers in the church, but he was captured by pirates and taken to Ireland, and there he was forced to tend sheep. And he says of himself that he prayed 100 times a day and recognized that his adversity helped him to grow as a Christian. Is that the testimony of anyone here? Can anyone here say, I was just a nominal Christian or didn't know Christ at all until I encountered adversity in my life, and through my troubles, I placed my faith and trust in Jesus, or I grew in my faith in Christ because of trouble? I would think that many of us would see that trouble in our lives has strengthened our faith in Christ. And certainly this was Patrick's testimony, that he went to Ireland as a nominal Christian, but then he grew in his faith. He escaped based on a voice told him to leave and head in a certain direction, so he headed east. He came to the coast and boarded a ship and returned to Britain. But there he had a vision, very much like Paul's Macedonian call. He had a vision in which someone from Ireland called him back, saying, please come back to Ireland and bring us the gospel. And so he studied. He actually went to Gaul to study, and there he was ordained. And in 432 he returned to Ireland. And when he was in Ireland, he, instead of establishing bishoprics and bishops, he established monasteries. And these monasteries were throughout Ireland, and there they preserved culture and learning through their transcriptions. Later on, when the Angles and the Saxons invaded England, they did not get as far as Ireland, and so the Irish monasteries preserved scholarship. So much more to say about Patrick, and when Toby presents his paper and publishes it on Blackboard, you'll learn a lot more about him. All right. Columba of Iona. Columba evangelized Scotland. He was a monk in Ireland. He was actually excommunicated because he led his clan in battle, which he was not supposed to do. But while he was in exile, he founded the abbey at Iona, and they conducted missions into Scotland. All right, they started in Scotland and then moved southward to evangelize northern England. Well, coming from the south and moving north was Augustine of Canterbury. I've already talked about his commission from Gregory I. The King Ethelbert married Christian Bertha, and he and his clansmen converted about 597. Boniface was born Winfrid. Winfrid was born in England, and he entered into a monastery, but he had a goal to go to what's now Germany and to evangelize there. And his method was to go to each clan, convert the chief or the prince, and then baptize and teach the people. All right, we'll talk about that later. One of the great stories about Boniface, he was born Winfrid. When he became a missionary, he took the name Boniface. And there was this, where he ministered, there was a sacred tree that was Thor's oak. And this oak was dedicated to Thor. And the pagans gathered around and worshiped there. And so Boniface took his axe, and with one blow, he felled that great oak. Pieces scattered in the form of a cross, and then and the people there recognized that Christ is king. And so the pieces were used to build a chapel dedicated to Peter. Anyone writing on Winfrid Boniface? Okay, good. Okay, that's right. You got a bunch of them. Good. Well, we'll have more from Brett on many of these stories that I'm just going through like that. Okay, so that kind of brings us to the close of the Western Church, but just let me make this summary statement. Missionaries came out of monasticism, all right? Popes influenced by monasticism or willing to use monks commissioned these missionaries. And so we have the papacy, monasticism, and the missions movement all tied together in these early centuries of the Western Church. All right, any questions or comments about Western Christianity? Yes, Toby?
Will we spend any more time speaking of the Crusades, or I know we mentioned it in the middle of the Western Church period there. Will we talk about it?
Oh, yeah.
Okay,
I will give you an entire lecture on Crusades.
great.
Okay? Very good. All right, well, let's move on then to talk about, bless you, Eastern Christianity. Again, through the 8th century, just as kind of a convenient dividing line for this particular lecture. Now, here is a map that shows you the Roman Empire and its division between the West and the East. And again, we see various dioceses: Britain, Gaul, Italy, Spain, Africa. But remember that when Constantine united the state with the church took the geographic regions of the empire and made them ecclesiastical regions. So a diocese is the equivalent of a political region. So here we have the West, and here we have the East that encompasses Greece and Asia Minor, what is now Turkey. Here we have Syria and Israel, the Holy Land, down into Egypt. So these are the areas that we refer to as the Eastern Church, and of course the capital is Constantinople. So the Eastern or Byzantine Empire endured intact until the 7th century. Actually, until even the 15th century, we have much of the Eastern Empire gathered around Constantinople, as opposed to the fall of Rome and the absence of imperial leadership in the West. So we still have emperors in the East housed in Constantinople, and they still exercise authority over the Patriarch of Constantinople. For example, you remember the story of John Chrysostom, who came into conflict with Eudoxia, the empress in the East, and through her influence on the very weak emperor, the emperor was able to send John Chrysostom into exile and death. So we have the power of the emperor over the Patriarch of Constantinople. Now we continue to have ecclesiastical schisms in the East, because the conflicts that were present in the earlier councils have not gone away. There's still theological disunity and political rivalry between Alexandria and Antioch. So, although we affirm Chalcedonian orthodoxy, we still have Nestorianism. We still have in Syria the headquarters of what we call the Nestorian Church. And the Monophysites, those in Alexandria who teach that Christ had one nature, the divine nature, they have not given up on that doctrine. And so we still have Monophysites vying for supremacy in Egypt. Now there's a threat of invasion by the Persians and barbarians, and that emphasized the need for religious unity. In 429, Vandals moved into North Africa. Remember, they came around and entered into North Africa, and so they brought Arianism into the region, and they remained in power until 533. And so the Vandals were threatening the Eastern Empire from the south, or that is, from North Africa. The Eastern Empire revived under the rule of Justinian. Justinian and his general Belisarius defeated the Vandals at Carthage in 533, returning Orthodox Christianity to North Africa instead of Arianism. His armies then invaded Italy and defeated the Ostrogoths, but that established a Byzantine presence in Italy, much to the consternation of the Bishop of Rome, who could, on the one hand, could find the help of the Byzantine emperor to be valuable in fighting off the Lombards, but was really more concerned that the Eastern emperor would try to exert his influence over the newly found power of the Roman bishop. And Justinian is going to convene the Council of Constantinople II in an effort to achieve religious unity in the East. In other words, we still have this conflict with the Monophysites. They're not giving up. The church is still divided over this issue. And so Justinian, in an attempt to unify his kingdom against the threat of the Persians in the east and the Vandals in the west, he's going to call a council, and they meet at Constantinople. So this is the second meeting, so it's called Constantinople II. All right, as I said, many Alexandrian Christians were dissatisfied with the Chalcedonian definition of Christ as having two natures, fully human and fully divine. So Justinian called the Second Council of Constantinople in 553, and as a result, the Chalcedonian definition was revised in line with Cyril's Alexandrian view of mystical union of the divine and human in the nature of Christ, which meant that, according to Cyril and Eutyches, Christ initially had two natures, but the human nature was subsumed by the divine nature as a drop of honey in the ocean. Okay, so this is actually the one council out of the seven that actually comes to a conclusion that is in opposition to what is now considered orthodoxy. So Constantinople II comes down on the side of monophysitism. And so the next debate is about Christ's will. They're saying that Christ has one nature, but then they're trying to say that does Christ have two wills, or does he have one will? Well, so we have another council Constantinople III. This is in 680, so it's another 150 years later. The debate is between the Monothelites versus the Duothelites. Monothelites agreed to two natures, but only one divine will. Duothelites claimed that two natures meant two wills. And so the Third Council of Constantinople reaffirmed the Chalcedonian definition that Christ has two distinct natures and amended the formula to include two wills not opposed to each other. The human will follows the divine will and is subject to it. So as a result of this Third Council of Constantinople, we have that Christ is fully human, fully divine, has a human nature, a divine nature, a human will, and a divine will. Okay, so this one returns to the orthodoxy of Chalcedon with just the further explanation that Christ has two wills. Okay, this one is probably more important in terms of its impact on the church, is Nicaea II, the Second Council at Nicaea. And this is a debate over the use of icons or images in worship. Well, I'm going to maybe do this next week. There were two groups. There were iconodules, who were icon kissers. Okay, you might want to, got your notes, write that on the side. Icon kissers. And they affirmed the use of icons in worship. Incarnation meant that the divine was joined to the human. And so could be represented in visual art. But the iconoclasts were icon smashers. And they disapproved of any visual art depicting Jesus, saying that images are idolatrous. All right, of course, by now we have Islam. Islam condemned any depictions of God, and so images impeded the conversion of Muslims. So these icon smashers were opposed to the icon kissers, and we had this major debate over the use of icons in worship. Well, the Empress Regent, who is Irene, favored icons, and so she called a council at Nicaea, so this is Nicaea II, the year is 787, and ultimately she affirmed, or the council affirmed, that icons are allowed in worship to affirm the incarnation of Christ. But notice this, icons certainly are useful in education. And in a society that is largely illiterate, icons are great teaching tools because they are visual aids. The problem comes when people go too far in accepting these icons as what they represent, and then they begin to actually worship the icons along with the persons represented by the icons. So people actually were allowed to bow down before and to kiss icons, but not to worship them. Do we see a problem here? Okay, very fine line, which we cannot distinguish. Evidently, they could sense the difference. So they did use icons in their worship, and people would bow down before them and would kiss them as an act of worship of those whom the icons represented. Worshipping of icons was forbidden. Worship was to be bestowed on God alone. All right. Now, both Western and Eastern churches accept the rule of Nicaea II. However, there are different interpretations. In the East, only flat or two-dimensional images were used. Okay, so this brings about the advent of icons, this beautiful Eastern art that's two-dimensional and highly symbolic. In the West, however, sculpture was allowed. And so this became one more difference between the East and the West. One more issue for Eastern and Western Christians to divide over. So increased tension between the East and the West. All right, I'm going to wrap this up here at this point.